Good evening. I'm Andrew Penn. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner and one of the co-founders of Open Nurses. And it is my pleasure to invite and welcome Melanie King Kawashima Velez, who is a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner in a community mental health agency in Eugene, Oregon. We're going to be talking a lot tonight about what's happening in Oregon. As many of you may be aware, there's a voter approved initiative to bring psilocybin access to people in Oregon. We'll be talking a lot about that. As you settle in here this evening, if you're watching this live and you'd like to put into the chat where you're coming from and what your background is, that would be great so we know who's in the audience. But I want to welcome you to this psychedelic chat that we do about once a month here at Open Nurses. So Melanie Velez is, she works in Eugene, Oregon, as I mentioned, doing and wearing, as many of us do, a number of different hats. Works in addiction medicine, court-mandated adult sexual behavior problems, perinatal and general psychiatry programs. Her postdoctoral work, she's DNP, focused on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, primarily with ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA. And she's currently one of only a few practitioners offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy to individuals served by Medicaid in the United States. That'll be a really interesting part of the conversation around access and insurance acceptance. Dr. Kawashima Velez is a graduate of the California Institute of Integral Studies for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, CPTR, in 2022, and also an instructor with the Subtle Winds Psilocybin Facilitator training program, focusing on community-supported wellness and harm reduction. Melanie received psychedelic ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training from CIIS, Temenos Center, and the Polaris Insight Center. And for the past 2 decades, she has offered volunteer psychedelic harm reduction support and now offers integration services, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and ketamine therapy apprenticeships in her private practice at Velez Psychiatric Services. Melanie also works at the Center for Family Development, offering psychiatric medication management and therapy for adult and child psychiatry, addiction medicine, and the perinatal psychiatry program. She's the founder of the Oregon Psychiatric Roundtable consultation group, co-lead of her local consultation circle for BIPOC-identifying individuals, and works with many Oregon entities to reduce risks of legal psilocybin and ketamine psychedelic experiences in the state of Oregon. So, without any further ado, let me welcome Melanie on the screen here.
Hey, good evening.
Hey, good evening, Melanie. How are you this evening?
Good. Hearing you say all the things I do makes me realize how busy I am.
I know, right? It's funny how when you hear it come out of somebody else's mouth, it's like, oh, that's why I'm tired. Yeah, and I know you just got back from a trip, and so appreciate you joining us here after a long day, probably. So, you know, we've been doing these interviews for really about 3 years now. Open Nurses is about as old as COVID. And so one of the questions we always like to just ask people is, you know, really, how'd you get here? You know, how did you wind up in the psychedelic space and nursing, and how'd you get involved in this work?
Yeah, I mean, so I have to couch that in where I come from. I'm so community-based. I identify as half Japanese, and that is so focused on community. And being in Eugene, Oregon, we are one of the most liberal cities in America. Psychedelics, you know, the Grateful Dead used to come here, and when they stopped touring, everyone just kind of landed here unless they could afford to go to Hawaii. And there's just always been this culture. I think I was steeped in it, and I didn't even realize what I was in. And I remember being, you know, like 15 years old at a party and the only sober one, and everyone's having this hard time. And I'm holding hair and doing this stuff and like trying to comfort people and like get the music quiet. And I didn't realize that was a job. I don't think that was, that was like facilitation. I didn't know that was what was happening. But it's just everywhere. I love to tell, I think I told you that story of, you know, we used to accidentally run over Ken Kesey's mailbox so we could like take it up and be like, hey, can we see the magic bus? And just, you know, go to the country fair. And it's just, it was everywhere. And I was like the last person to want to do that. It just looked like the worst time, the hardest trips. Why would I want to throw up? And then as I became a nurse and I married a psychiatrist, and I went back and got my Psych NP degree. Just talking with him, the medicines didn't seem like they were doing what I thought they would do as I was learning about it. And I thought there had to be more. And I basically roped him into going to the CPTR program with me. And, realizing the research side of it and realizing, everything that I'd already been doing kind of in harm reduction spaces at the country fair, for those of you who know the Oregon Country Fair. I think it just kind of naturally came together very slowly for me.
I've never been to the country fair, but I know some friends that are involved with it. It sounds sort of like Burning Man, but not. So for those who are not familiar with the Oregon Country Fair, what might one find there?
Sure. The Oregon Country Fair has been around since the 60s. It actually started as a Renaissance Fair, and the people who run Renaissance Fair were like, you can't call it that anymore because that is not what we're doing. And it was, it was a lot of hippies and a lot of just free, open thinking and no taboos on psychedelics or on just being together in community, being with the land, even like permaculture things. And then it's gotten so popular now that it's almost like a commercialized thing during the day. And then at the night, the staff, we stay and we just circle together and we are together and we use music and dance and all kinds of things just to deeply lean into each other. We call it Fair Family. Mm. And Whitebird / Rock Medicine is there helping support people through really difficult trips. The point being that we don't use any services from outside. They don't need to be police on the inside. They don't need to be a bunch of emergency service. We do everything ourselves. All the doctors from the community, psychiatry from the community, nurses from the community are essential, therapists from the community. Mm-hmm.
So it's in that same taking care of our own kind of ethos that like Zendo does at Burning Man.
Like pre-Zendo, but more closely tied to medical.
Gotcha.
We always go out in pairs.
Gotcha. So you mentioned you talked about the medicine, you talked about the community. Yeah, I'm interested. So where do you feel like nurses fit into this, and what do nurses bring to psychedelic work?
Yeah, I think we're the linchpin, right? We are like, my husband's Puerto Rican, right? And so there's this concept called code switching, right? Where it's a cultural thing and it's also a language thing. And we're translating for lobbyists, insurance companies, researchers, people in community mental health, clients who are, a high percentage of my clients are actually already microdosing themselves or using psychedelics or have used psychedelics many times in the past, sometimes even before the 60s. Mm-hmm. And so we're able to kind of translate all of that together with research and evidence-based and safety and a public health mindset, and do it in a way that's calm and a balanced approach. Mm-hmm. Psychedelics obviously aren't for everybody, as we're finding out in the Oregon space right now. But the people they work for, it can be beautiful and hard to understand.
Yeah, that's a great segue to really would love to dig down into what you are. So tell it for the people that have not heard about initiative. It's 109, right? I'm remembering that correctly. Tell us about that and how that came about and where you are in the process and what's happening there on the ground, because it's just so different than a lot of the rest of the country.
Yeah. So a couple things happened in 2020. We did another measure that decriminalized possession of any substance in small personal use quantity. And that's statewide, certainly not federally. And then we also passed Measure 109, which allows individuals to have non-medical, non-therapy psilocybin experiences with certified facilitators in legal service centers that is all run by the Oregon Health Authority.
Okay, so to be clear, this is so people can have a psilocybin experience, specifically psilocybin. This doesn't apply to LSD or MDMA or anything like that. This is psilocybin only, and they can have an experience, but it can't be offered as, say, we're going to treat your depression or we're going to treat your PTSD. It's like it's a carnival ride. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, it's just an experience.
But it's an
Yeah.
experience, right? Okay. So that was the part that I was struggling to understand a little bit, that's under the law, if I have this right, that you specifically can't offer a therapeutic experience. Is that correct?
Well, that's where we get into gray area. So
Okay.
it's all of the law is set up, and all of the design and requirement around offering it is set up like it's therapy. You must do at least one preparation session. You do an administration. You have to offer at least one integration session. So all the things, the components that we would think about with therapy and even some of the research, but you cannot call it therapy. You might be able to call it therapeutic, and that's a queasy gray area. So I just call it an experience.
Mm-hmm.
And for me as a nurse and a psych nurse practitioner, I'm in this real tricky gray zone. I cannot wear my hat of being a psych nurse practitioner. I can't wear my hat of giving you therapy, but I have all of these tools as a facilitator to support you going through this experience, leaning into the medicine, seeing even the difficult parts of the journey as an opportunity, not running away from it. And because of that, I have a lot of barriers, right? Personally, and my license is in mid-process, and I actually paused it. I thought I would be licensed already by now, and I paused it because I talked with my attorney, who would like to charge around $3,000-ish for a set of forms that they want each of my clients to sign that says, even though Dr. Melanie Velez is a psych nurse practitioner, and she has all this therapy training and all this other stuff, and she's just going to be a facilitator. She's just there to sit with your experience. She's not going to use any of her skills. She's not going to do therapy on you. It's not a medical treatment. This isn't indicated for depression. I'm not prescribing anything to them. And they have to sign these series of forms from my attorney so that they promise to remember that I'm not doing any of those things while they're in an expanded state of consciousness. Hopefully they remember it. So
this really points to a tricky area of, like, when am I a nurse and when am I not a nurse, right? You know, if I'm in the grocery store and I see somebody who they're turning blue and holding their thing, I'm going to make an assessment that they're choking, right? And I'll be a good Samaritan and, do the Heimlich maneuver. But it really raises an interesting question. If you're sitting with somebody who's ingested psilocybin, when are you acting as a nurse and when are you not?
From the moment I step into the service center as a facilitator, right?
Yeah.
Which is different than a harm reduction worker, because I might do that some of that too, right? But if I step into the service center as a facilitator, I'm just a facilitator. I may use therapeutic techniques, right? I have a bachelor's of art in music. I may use singing. I may use somatic approaches, right? And we're only allowed to touch hands, feet, shoulders, and give a hug. That is the only approach.
That's by law.
That is by law.
The law says
and there's
that. Wow.
all these gray areas then, right? Can I hold your hair if you're vomiting? Can I pat you on the back if you feel like you're kind of choking on some spittle, right? So there's tremendous amount of ambiguity, but by and large, I'm not a nurse. I may have some skills that I can bring. I'm not calling it therapy. I'm not endorsing it as a medical treatment.
Okay, got it. And so walk me through this. If I was living in Oregon and I wanted to,
you can live where you're living, and I have people coming from out of state.
Okay, so you're going to have psychedelic tourism.
We already are, yes.
You already are. This is, become the Amsterdam of the United States, right?
Sure.
So if I come up there and I say, I want to, as you're saying, I was thinking it almost sounds like, if you're learning to skydive or something, you're going to take these prep classes and then you're going to, go through this with somebody. I guess there's probably no integration in skydiving, but so I come up there and then what happens? How does one access this, and what does the process look like? Walk me through it.
Yeah. Some people approach a facilitator directly. There's a list on the Oregon Health Authority website that is not updated. It mostly has non-BIPOC identified individuals listed on there right now. But you can also contact service centers directly and say, I'm looking for this. I want this. A lot of them have long wait lists. Some of them are actually moving through their wait list very quickly.
Okay.
And each of them are different in their setup. I think bendable therapy doesn't charge anything. It's donation based. It's a not-for-profit. There's a whole bunch of different ones with a whole bunch of different models, but you can contact them and say, this is what I'm looking for. And you will probably be afforded a list of facilitator bios that you can look through. Or if you know who you want, you can say, I want this person or I want this type of person. Some of the requests we're getting are specific language, right? Because sometimes that happens in altered state of consciousness where you actually go back to your native tongue. I've had people switch to Japanese only, or, Spanish or Portuguese or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will talk to the facilitator. You need to meet them first at least one time and do a prep session. You're going to go through a whole bunch of forms, but you're also going to do an interview process. And that's proving really tricky. I think there's such a drive to want to have this experience and to want to have a huge experience that I think I've heard stories of clients really pushing for highest possible dose, which is about 50 milligrams, which we thought would be like 5 grams of dried cubensis for those of you who are in that world doing that. And it seems like with the psilocin content we're seeing, maybe it's more like 7 or 8, depending on the batch and strain, right? And facilitators are having to learn how to educate clients on, this is the strain, this is the psilocybin content, here's the psilocin content if we know it, and here's where we think you might want to fall in dose range. But there's still a lot of pushback, and there's also a lot of disincentive to be honest about one's past mental health or medical conditions, because they just want to have the trip so badly, right? And so there's a whole set of things that I do and that I train my students at Subtle Winds to do, to how to elicit honest response and how to have a really reasoned and calm discussion about it, and really choose dose and strain very carefully. So you would do that with your facilitator, and then you would pick a day and you would come in, and we don't touch the medicine. Facilitators don't touch the medicine. So that's actually protection for nurses. The service center worker will touch the medicine. The client must take it themselves. You can have up to 2 doses. So you can split your dose and make some game time decisions about if you want to accept less or not. And then you have your experience. The amount of time you stay in the service center that's minimum is dependent on the dose you take, up to 6 hours. Some people, because of the condition they're in, have actually had to stay much longer, even longer than 12 hours. And then, afterward, you have to have someone drive you home. We usually try and encourage people to have a really safe container, a soft landing spot to go home to. And then we'll offer you an integration. Could be the next day, could be in person, could be on Zoom. So that's the general process.
So when you said earlier that you paused, we're getting some feedback here. When you said you paused your license, which license were you pausing?
The Oregon Health Authority psilocybin facilitation license. I'm still a nurse. I'm still practicing as a psych nurse practitioner, but I paused the processing of my license so that I could talk to my attorney, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And I'm still having a lot of community discussion about should I spend $3,000 to protect my license when the forms of the OHA specifically already state you may not use, you are not allowed to use your other scopes of practice. You may only operate in the scope of practice as a psilocybin facilitator. So do I really need to spend $3,000 to do that? That's a huge barrier. In addition to the $2,000 I have to pay just for my license. So it's $5,000 right out the gate before I even.
Okay. So you would be giving the psilocybin in the context of being a psilocybin facilitator, not as a nurse.
Right. So I'm not going to be a nurse. I'm going to be a facilitator at a service center. I'm not going to give any medicine. They're going to go get it at the service center. They're going to take it. Yep. And then they're going to come into a room with me and I sit with them. So in a way, it feels like harm and risk reduction more than it feels like a violation of the law when it's in actual practice.
Okay. So many questions. So where does the psilocybin come from?
So there are certified legal grows happening. Satori, Satya, Ashland, Portland, they're all inspected. They're all video monitored. They're all tested in a laboratory.
Okay. And all of these experiences, they have to be individual experiences, or can people come in a group and do this?
They can be individual, couples, or groups. And the size of the group is, again, determined by the amount of dose. Right, 25 milligrams, you're going to need a lower ratio of clients to a single facilitator, right? So you have a bigger group, you're going to need several facilitators to be working in concert together to facilitate a group experience.
Okay. And you've, so I'm coming at this as you know, but maybe people at home don't know that, I do this in the research space. And so, we have exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria, and all those kind of things. It sounds like you may have some as well. Now, when you say 25 milligrams, I'm used to that measurement from psilocybin, from synthetic psilocybin, which is what we have to use in all research studies. But you're using fungal fruiting bodies, right? These are dried mushrooms.
We are. I'm giving a talk with you tomorrow, actually, where I have pictures of what it's like. You can buy it as a whole body mushroom, or you can buy it ground up in a package, and it is the wild, wild west. Right. Okay. Even if you know in a lab how much psilocybin there is and how much psilocin there is, it does not appear to be a real precise indicator the way it might be coming from a laboratory of how strong perceptually it's going to feel. And of course, each of us are different in our perception, but there does appear to be a difference among strain. Okay. And psilocin appears to have probably a little more impact in terms of how strong the medicine feels than we may have anticipated before.
So it sounds like you're trying to get away from the measured dried fruiting body measurement, so to say, 3.5 grams or something like that, and more into what percentage of that dried fungi is psilocybin and psilocin. So you have it almost reminds me of like morphine equivalents or something like that,
Yeah, exactly. And the reason for that is because different strains have different amounts of psilocybin and psilocin kind of inherently. Okay. And a bunch of other things that we don't fully understand in science that add to or alter the perceptual experience.
Got it. And that analysis is being done by the growers, or are there independent labs, or where's that data coming from?
So mushroom spores at the grower, they do the fruiting body, they harvest it, they send some pieces to the lab. Right. And even amongst those, it's not a perfect science about is this side of the bucket, higher psilocybin content than that side of the bucket. Right. And so the lab will test it, and the lab will give you a report and tell you what it is. And then the grower takes that report back and has to package. And they have to display on the package what the content is and when it was grown, and an estimated expiration date of, I think, a couple of years, something like that. And then they will send it to the service center. And then the service center will sell it to the client. The facilitator never touches the medicine, right? Okay. So nurses being facilitators will never touch the medicine.
Okay.
But they are required to kind of help educate the client about how to choose a dose and a strain and that kind of thing.
Okay. Wow, this is so different than a parking lot at a Grateful Dead show.
Yeah, it is true facilitation. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused. Oh, I've had mushrooms all the time. I don't need to go have a facilitated experience. And it's qualitatively different to have space held for you.
So people are starting to put in questions in the chat, and they can certainly do that. We'll do a chunk of questions at the end, but there's an obvious question I was going to ask here, which is, what's the Oregon Board of Nursing have to say about this? What do they think?
Oh, not a whole lot. I think it's kind of a wait and see approach. And I really have a lot of compassion for them. There's no incentive for them to say anything. In fact, there's an anti-incentive, that's not our purview. We don't want anything to do with that. I think they care. I think they care, like all nurses do, about harm, risk, outcomes. And I think nurses are probably actually one of the best in terms of being like the ethical warriors and the harm and risk reduction warriors. Most of the nurses I know that are in this space or very adjacent and very close to this space are really focused not on protecting their license, but on protecting the individuals, protecting the citizens who are coming for these experiences. Sure. So Josiah Laughlin, who you've interviewed, we are getting together with Jamie Mayo and a few other people to try and approach the Oregon State Board of Nursing to say, here's what we're thinking. Mm-hmm. Do you have any gut sense or any kind of things that you can tell us? Not all those conversations have happened. And I do want to touch on one big ethical dilemma. Mm-hmm. And the ethical dilemma is, and I actually posited this to a group of nurses who's in this space and working on these projects. And I said, should I hold a barrier? Should I hold an ethical barrier that says, if I am your psychiatric prescriber and your therapist, I will never give you psilocybin. I will only sit in psilocybin facilitation with someone who is not my client. And we had a whole debate about that. And it came down to some kind of case examples I gave. As you mentioned in my bio, I serve sex offenders. These are individuals with pedophilic disorder. A lot of them have been in prison, beaten within an inch of their life because of the disorder that they really do struggle with. I mean, some of them, maybe don't have much insight, but a lot of them do. They don't want to have this disorder. They would do anything to get rid of it. A lot of them are very, very suicidal, and they just can't seem to change their perspective on it. And these medicines are perspective changers. And that's some of the work that I've done in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is with pedophilic disorder, and had some really beautiful success with that at some points. And so I could see a world where a client of mine with pedophilic disorder says, this is too sensitive for me to talk with anyone who doesn't have a deep knowledge of me, some kind of therapeutic understanding of what pedophilic disorder is, because there's so much stigma around it. Mm-hmm. So the debate is raging. I don't know what the right answer is for me and holding my boundaries. And that would be helpful for the Oregon State Board of Nursing to just have a discussion.
And have you had, so you're an NP, which means you most likely have a DEA number, as it goes without saying that psilocybin is still a Schedule I substance as far as the federal government is concerned. Is there any concern for advanced practice nurses who have DEA numbers as to how this is going to square? Because I know in California, when we passed Prop 215 back in 1996, one of the reasons why cannabis was not prescribed is because it's illegal to prescribe a Schedule I drug. So the verbiage around that was just that a clinician, a physician, they didn't actually include NPs in that law, said could recommend cannabis, and then you could take that recommendation, go to a dispensary, and buy whatever you wanted. And that was intentional to protect physicians from having their DEA number pursued by the DEA. So is there any thought around that and how that's going to square with the federal government with a Schedule I substance?
Yeah, I have to just kind of hope and trust that the DEA and the federal government really isn't interested in one gal in Oregon, helping sit with people in their sexual trauma or whatever, trying to get out of what's going on for them. And in another way, the Oregon law in some ways was very thoughtful and well written. It's very, very clear. This is completely outside the scope of practice. This is in no way medical, right? There's no endorsement here. There's no recommendation that I can make. And I tell that to my clients because they actually come to me and they say, oh, Melanie, now that there's decrim, I should probably tell you I've been microdosing for the last 3 years. And I'm going to the psilocybin church down the road. And I'm having these, ayahuasca trips. And by the way, ayahuasca, there's 3 fully federally legal churches in Oregon for ayahuasca medicine, the Santo Daimes. And, so it's really just an environment where people are just being open and honest about it now, where they didn't feel they could be before. So that's actually harm and risk reduction. And the way the law is written for me sitting with someone, it really feels like harm and risk reduction. Mm-hmm. I'm very clear, like I can't recommend this medicine for you, but if you're going to go into a tricky space and you really need someone to sit with you, I think that's okay.
Yeah. And you'd mentioned earlier that with regards to the screening process, the intake process, that there is, I think you said something about there's kind of a disincentive for people to be fully forthcoming about their own history in there. What would be reasons why a psilocybin service center would say, I don't think this is a good idea for you?
Cannot give psilocybin to anyone on lithium, anyone with a history of psychosis, which welcome to gray area. What if it was methamphetamine induced and we're really trying to, use this to help us stay off methamphetamine, right? What if it was, hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucination, right? So no psychosis, no active suicidal ideation.
Okay.
I wish they had added no active non-suicidal self-harm. If you've ever had to sit with someone in facilitation where they're trying to, peel the skin off their arms for 4 hours, that's no fun. That's not great for anybody. Right. So it's not a perfect law, but those are like the 3 biggies. What's surprising was what wasn't on there actually. You can be
Wow.
pregnant or breastfeeding and be like, I want to do it. And it's up to the discretion of the service center and the facilitator, right? And that puts a huge barrier or kind of a moral distress on us.
And so since correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if nobody in the service center is acting in the role of a licensed healthcare clinician, who's making those assessments as to whether or not somebody had a history of psychosis or not? Because that's a clinical decision to make.
Yeah.
So who's
Let's
asking
go
those
back to
questions?
your analogy. Yeah, let's go back to your analogy of the roller coaster ride at the fair.
Yeah.
I mean, there are inherent risks being on a roller coaster ride, and it's kind of up to you, right, as the client who's getting on this ride to say, I want to do this. The risk is acceptable to me. It's really a kind of a risk benefit analysis that each client is doing for themselves. Now, in the harm and risk reduction space, I've been working with my husband and Dr. Michael Howdy and a few cardiologists to try and offer a curbside consultation service called Oregon Psychedelic Travel Clinic, where we have facilitators encourage clients to go talk to their primary care or to their psychiatric prescriber, and that we can then on the back end of that be a curbside consult and look at things. It's like, okay, you have SVT. What is that going to mean for psilocybin? What is that going to mean for ketamine, right?
Right. So, I'm thinking like in our studies, we generally don't, we generally exclude people that have a personal or first degree relative history of psychosis, right? So if if your mom had schizophrenia, we can't admit you into our studies. And part of, we're finding that out through, a conversation in which, so for example, somebody might not ever say, oh, my mom had schizophrenia. But if this person says, well, my mom used to talk about, the FBI agents that were trying to kill us through the windows, I may, as a clinician, make a reasonable assumption that mom had psychosis, and therefore this person's not going to qualify for the study. But I'm trained in that. So what I guess I'm wondering is if somebody is working in a service center who is not trained as a clinician, and even if they were, they can't act as a clinician by law, who's making that decision? So what you're saying is, because what I guess where that makes me uneasy is that I'm, as a roller coaster rider, I'm making a reasonable assumption that somebody in, health and safety, government, somebody has vetted this thing, right? I don't need to be a mechanical engineer in order to assess whether or not I'm going to go on a roller coaster. I'm putting my trust in some kind of regulatory agency that oversees roller coasters, who said, okay, this is safe, right? And whereas this sounds like we're asking individual people who are interested in psilocybin to know all the risks of that experience and to assess themselves. Am I off base here?
No, there's a couple of things you're missing that are kind of helpful protectors. One is training programs, right? So as a trainer at Subtle Winds, all of my students, one of the things that we try and do is say, these are the big warning signs. And the facilitators have a tremendous incentive to weed people out. I think, we were looking at, what was the big one in the Netherlands that stopped? Was Synthesis. I think they were rejecting somewhere between 50 and 75% of participants requesting a journey because they were on meds, they had a condition, there was some kind of mental health concern. So the facilitators have every incentive to not do your journey other than, trying to make money and trying to keep the service alive. But I think there's at least in Subtle Winds, there's a tremendous incentive to not just give everyone a trip. And that's part of my job as a trained clinician, teaching them how to do that is to teach them what to look for. So there's that. And then there's a whole set of Oregon forms that is publicly available online. You can go look at all the required forms. There's like 9 or 11. It's almost a nauseating amount of forms, which again makes nurses great for this work. We're so good at paperwork. So we go through all of the kind of common known risks. And we really encourage people actually to just say, hey, be open with your primary care or an Oregon primary care, where there's decrim and a lot, maybe more acceptance and less cultural stigma about just talk about this, talk about your risk and just weigh it out. Whether or not you tell them if you actually do it or not, at least go talk about it. And, we don't ask about, in Oregon, we don't ask about first degree relative with psychosis. We
Hmm.
don't.
And
But we do try and talk to them in preparation about it.
And there is some attempt at collecting data on outcomes, right? Could you tell? Yeah, I know this is controversial. So, but if I remember right, and help me understand this better, but there was an attempt to have a centralized database of if there is a bad outcome, if somebody goes into AFib during this, or somebody develops a manic episode afterwards, that is centrally reported, so there can be some attempt at seeing if there's risks that we don't yet know that can be identified. Just like reporting adverse events to the FDA of a new drug, it helps us identify what there might be some risks there. So, what's the status of that?
Well, my personal opinion, it's not going great right now because it seems like I'm getting more reports than I'm aware that Nexus is getting. We call it the Nexus or Open, which is funny because you're open nurses. But reporting
no relation.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The way that I'm understanding it now from my friends who are working in emergency medicine and working on the front lines, it's not clear who and how to report to. There's no incentive to do the reporting. It's just extra paperwork and extra time in a very busy emergency room setting. Some of the time, because I've heard of probably I would say 3 adverse events now that are pretty significant. And a lot of it probably came down to insufficient preparation or not being forthcoming on the part of the client who was purchasing about what maybe their mental health risks were. I haven't heard of any serious medical risks or medical adverse events coming out. They've all been more psychiatric in nature.
Okay.
And so there's not a great coordination yet. And that's part of where nurses are so great, because we're here, we're seeing it. I mean, my friends who are in the back hall of the ER are like, you got to help us do something because we're not communicating. We're not sure this is supposed to go somewhere. You tell us where to go. You're the one who teaches the mushroom thing, right? So it all comes down to the safety being the underground. The safety is the community connections. The safety is the relationships that we've built for years and years and years from Fair Family, right?
Right. So you're the mushroom nurse. They come to you with questions. Is it?
I think I'm a ketamine nurse, but okay.
Who's responsible for reporting that then? Is it this facility? Is it the service center, or is it the clinician who receives that patient in an emergency room, or where's that reporting mandate coming from?
In one of the adverse events, I'm not even sure the service center is aware they had an adverse event. The client got pretty paranoid and ran off, literally out of state, ran off. And so, a person who's paranoid and thinking people are out to get them, they're not going to be calling up the service center. They're going, oh, this isn't good. They're just not going to show up for their integration, and integration isn't required. It only is required to be offered, right? There's no integration police coming after you and be like, you didn't talk about your growth or whatever, So yeah, it's challenging. It comes down to probably first responders, whether that's ambulance, Cahoots in our town, which is a beautiful model of a mental health crisis response, where a trained mental health worker and an EMT go into the field together in a van and just talk to people where they are and give them food and a snack and check a blood pressure and then kind of assess it.
And it's called Cahoots. I love that.
Yeah. Citizens assisting, helping out on the streets or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. So kind of like a mental health response program, non law enforcement mental health response. Yeah.
Because they just run away if they see the police coming, so that doesn't really help. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we got questions coming in, but I want to just do a little thought exercise here, if you would indulge me. So, you guys are pioneers, Oregon, we're the left, California, it's the left coast. It doesn't get any weirder than it does out here, right? So if we're gonna, we're the test case, you're the test case, I should say. California just vetoed, the governor just vetoed the decrim bill here, so we won't be looking at this for at least another couple of years probably. But if you were to run this out, we're always future casting in psychedelics, right? When is MDMA going to be available? When is these studies going to be done? So 5 years from now, could you give me a sort of best case scenario where things go really well and what that looks like? And could you also give me an idea of if this were to go sour, What would that, where do you see there being risks, and how could nurses be involved in possibly mitigating those risks?
Yeah. Again, nurses are kind of perfectly positioned. Because we tend to work in community and talk to each other a lot, and that is so far the best, most functional part of the safety net I've seen.
Uh-huh.
B, because we're trained both medically and psychiatrically from, a non-stigmatizing place of care,
Uh-huh.
and keeping the person at the center of everything. And then, the reason why I got my doctorate of nursing practice instead of a PhD was because I wanted to do direct application research. I don't want to do like ivory tower, like, does this work or doesn't it work? What I want to know is, does this mushroom that Andrew's researching work in my community? Does it work
Uh-huh.
in my clinic? Right. So I want to do this direct kind of work. And that's the magic, right? Being able to do system and program design and to do program evaluation would be the best, right?
Right.
Having nurses come to Oregon and volunteer their services just to sit by and say, hey, if you need me to check a blood pressure and the client says they want their blood pressure checked, great, I'll just do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There are so many ways for nurses to get involved into this world, into the world of psychedelics. I talked about Oregon Psychedelic Travel Clinic, where beforehand we're coordinating and helping, do a risk review. There's no such thing as medical clearance for this. That can't exist, but a risk review so clients can make their own decision. And then, on the back end, really setting up safety nets well, right? People have thrown around the idea of psychedelic foster care and, having people go through a healing journey and then they can't go back and be homeless in a tent. Like, that doesn't work, right? So having all these alternative models, there's I think Moksha Journeys down in Ashland is doing the Transcendence program, which is, I think, like up to 28-day residential substance use treatment. And there's psilocybin components in that.
So they're doing a 28-day substance use program with psilocybin?
So it's a treatment program where you go and you live there and you're doing the therapies and all the things, and then the option of going to a legal Oregon Psilocybin Service Center in Ashland and having some journeys and having staff support and go back and forth and really creating a container. I don't know that it's up and going yet, but those models are emerging. So when you talk about positive gains from this, those are the kinds of things that I'm like, that's what I want to know about as a clinician who works in addiction medicine. Okay. And then the harms, I think we're already seeing the harms, people having mostly some challenging mental health outcomes, and their friends and family, the support container of the community around them, not really aware of what's happening or what's needed or how to lean in, how to get services. And that is my goal. And that's why I work with psychiatrists and therapists in the town where I am. Because I want someone, if you're going to have a bad experience on psilocybin, I want you ASAP to get the services regardless of what your insurance is.
Mm-hmm. And what is the cost of these experiences?
Sure. Well, bendable therapy is donation only, so potentially zero, up to, I think the most expensive one I've seen is in the $3,700-ish range.
For a single experience, or is that with the prep and
preparation, administration for 6 hours, and integration? Yeah, it's a whole package deal usually.
It's 3,700. Okay.
Yep, there's a few service centers. One in Ashland, I think it's Omnia, where you can pay the $500 room fee, and then you pay your facilitator their own fee, and then the medicine fee. If you're going big medicine, it's like $150-ish. And if you're going smaller doses, maybe it's like $80-ish, $70-ish.
Okay, so you're kind
of
paying for that.
Microdosing is probably much less than that.
Paying for individual components of the experience in that situation.
Yeah.
And presumably not covered by insurance because it's not a medical treatment.
Bingo.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with insurance or medical, other than my malpractice insurance. But that even doesn't really apply here. I think the biggest part insurance-wise is service centers are trying to get insurance, and that's a challenge. And having nurses on site who can monitor for safety would actually help the case of service centers getting insurance.
Oh, interesting. But then aren't they working as nurses? if they do that?
Yeah, but
If
they're not facilitating the mushroom. They're not
Oh,
touching
they're
the
not facilitators. Okay, so they would be employees of the, but not facilitators, but they would be kind of like our medical monitors and studies. Got it. Okay.
bingo.
They'd be a consultant if somebody started having medical issues. I see. Okay, that's helpful. That's really helpful. All right, so we've got some questions here. I'm going to go with the most poetic one here that Jeffrey has thrown up here. So I think this is somebody from Portland saying, being from the city of roses, what do you feel is the bud, thorn, and rose emerging from this emerging field for nurses in particular? So interpret that as you wish.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I usually start with thorns when we play roses and thorns at dinner at our family dinner table with our kids. So I'll start with a thorn. Thorn is, it's really fun to be super excited about the healing potential of psychedelics and go, yay, a mushroom will heal everyone. And it's just like, hope is a beautiful medicine and also a big trap. And the thorn is that I kind of have to be the person as the nurse in the room who brings the balanced voice and says, listen, these medicines aren't for everybody. And there's actually big requirements for me to feel safe to facilitate personally, right? I don't want to give you a journey where you're in a big grief process and you don't have a therapist and you don't have a support container afterward. You're just going to go home and, sometimes these medicines make people worse before they make them better. Or sometimes, people have paradoxical reactions, with the classic antidepressants under age 26, they get suicidal. We don't understand why. And these medicines in particular are really unpredictable. The bud, I think, is people are going to start realizing how powerful nurses are in this space. I would say I see nurses doing more things, being more proactive, really like in terms of boots on the ground, what they're doing in the emergency room, what I'm doing with my colleagues on Signal, trying to help coordinate services and get people to the help that they need and get people the safety support they need, more than some of the other healing professions. So I think that's the bud, is that we're so well positioned to do this work. Like we just bring so much, like we are the safety monitors, right? We are the people who are okay with touch. All the things that we bring. And then the rose, I think access. I'm seeing people come from across the United States. I've seen people come from as far as Florida to come have a legal journey.
Wow.
And to hear some of the stories of healing that are happening, it just makes me want to cry with joy. Just the overall consciousness raising of the medicine that they're going to bring back to their communities, to the potential to demystify, destigmatize, but still in a safe, it's not for everybody kind of way. That's beautiful.
So this is kind of a related question. Let me just pull it up here about, so if I'm a nurse in Oregon, or even outside of Oregon, we get asked this all the time at Open Nurses, like, where can I do this work? And there's the obvious answer of ketamine clinics, because those are fairly ubiquitous. There's harm reduction spaces, but the reality is that there are not as many spaces as we might be able to practice other kinds of care. So what would you say to a nurse who is listening to this in Oregon, who says, wow, I'm super inspired, Melanie, I want to do this. Where can I sign up? I want to quit my job. I want to do this. What would you tell them?
So I would say, going back to my roots, it's community medicine, it's festival medicine. It's looking around at your community and saying, what's needed in my community? It might be integration. It might be volunteering for somewhere like Fireside Project, because actually what you're going to find is, I think one of the individuals who, I wouldn't call it an adverse event, but they had a harder time and they needed more integration than maybe their facilitator had available at that moment. They ended up calling Fireside Project, I believe. They called up a telephone tech support to help complete integration, right? I wrote down some answers to this question. Now I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, we had Josh.
I would say affinity groups would be the other thing, right? So I'm a member of the Asian Psychedelic Collective. There's, Jewish Psychedelic Association. There's Ligari the Christian Psychedelic Association. There's all of these different affinity groups that some that are, I really like the Ethical Psychedelic International Community Signal Thread, EPIC. And it's truly international. I run into people from all over the world there, and to be able to do the ethics work in this place, and that gets you connected to the other places that you maybe need to be. And so it's really about working like a mushroom mycelium and making the connections, and then it just unfolds and you'll find your place.
Yeah.
That's how it's important for me.
Just want to follow up with a plug for Fireside. We had Josh White on this interview series maybe a year or so ago. Josh White is one of the executive directors of Fireside, which is really an opportunity. If you're interested in volunteering in this space, it's a telephone or text support where people are having a difficult time on a psychedelic or integrating a psychedelic can call and get peer support. So that's another place where nurses can certainly volunteer. You mentioned ethics, and of course that's obviously a huge nut to crack, but there's several questions in here around the ethics of, say, access and equity. If these things, I know you said some places are not charging anything or they're donation only, but I imagine those are probably few and far between unless they're being, robustly funded by philanthropy, because, most people don't have the luxury of working for free. But then one of the sites you were talking said $3,700, I think. And so, that's going to be available, $3,700 cash, no insurance reimbursement. That's going to be limited to a pretty small number of people. So it seems like Oregon really struggled with this tension between access, which means, maybe lower level of training, lower level of containment, and then this more medicalized model, which may be safer, but definitely more expensive. Nurses always feel like we're kind of the people. We're not the highest paid professionals in the hospital, but we're in some ways the most accessible. So tell us a little more about these sort of ethical things that you see that are going to be challenging and need to be worked out in the years ahead.
Yeah. So as an Asian identifying individual, I think I both have some privilege to call out and also see a lot of need to call out. And there are service centers who do a tremendous amount of work. I think it's Journeys up in Portland. That's like, I think 10 journeys a month that are just tremendously discounted for historically marginalized communities. Right. So each service center is going to be different. Unfortunately, for the consumer, they're going to have to do their homework a little bit. And remember that this, even though January 1st happened and it ta-da, it's state legal, right? It took a long time to get service centers inspected, up and rolling, and they're still in their first iteration of learning how to do this work and not go bankrupt. And maybe some of them will. I mean, we certainly saw that in cannabis space. And I think we're still figuring out retreats and retreat style kind of affordability of scale. One of the retreats that I hope to be able to put on is a nurses healing nurses retreat with the option of ketamine and legal Oregon psilocybin journey.
What would that look like, Melanie? If your dream were to come true, what would that look like?
Yeah. I've been working with Reconsider, who I think is a sponsor here, about giving, maybe 5 or 6 days, maybe 30 nurses in one place with 4 or 5 or 6 of us nurses and some of the BIPOC facilitator group that I work with and help host in my home almost every month, coming together and giving them these tools that I learned as a psych nurse practitioner and that other nurses have. Adrienne Bawa, the sound healer, there's massage, there's acupuncture, acupressure, there's hypnotherapy, there's CE cert, there's all kinds of resiliency coping tools for nurses you can use in the moment on your unit, ways to kind of adjust some of the toxic and burnout culture that's been happening and just brewing from what I hear, and really ringing the bell for nurses of saying COVID isn't running our units and our lives the way that it used to. And when it stops running your life and you can celebrate and mark that moment, there's something, I think, magical that can happen to your whole nervous system. and we can sit with each other and just be and just hold each other. And sometimes community is the best medicine, just being with each other.
Kind of related to the learning aspect of this, question came in about working this into nursing curriculum. So for people that aren't even yet nurses, do you see this being part of what we're teaching nurses in the future?
Yeah, I think it's already starting to happen. I think I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there's like a listing for psychedelic therapies in some of the nursing textbooks that are coming out, and the psych nursing textbooks that are coming out. So really, I think it's coming. And I think I've heard of a few nursing schools, not just here in the Pacific Northwest, talking about opening up and just at least discussing it. And that's one thing that nurses can do right now, and something that I do. I chose to go to school in West Texas at Texas Tech because I needed to get out of the groupthink of the Pacific Northwest, where psychedelics are great, it's fine, why would you not, right? And go into Texas, where they don't have full practice authority like we do here in Oregon, and see for myself what the difference was, feel the culture. And then now I get to I sent links back to Texas Tech, and I said, hey, I'm giving these talks. Hey, these things are happening. What do you think about it? How can we talk about it?
Right. And speaking of talks, and at the risk of gratuitous self-promotion, you and I are doing a talk for Sigma Theta Tau tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock Pacific time, which is an ungodly early hour, but I know we'll both do our best to show up caffeinated like an early hospital shift, but we're going to be talking more about this tomorrow. And I think that's a free webinar. If you go to the Sigma Theta Tau website, you can register for that. And if you don't want to get up at 7 a.m., you can watch it on the record later. But so we're almost at the top of the hour here, and I want to just ask you. We kind of have a traditional ending question for these interviews, and I think it's kind of a sweet one. But it's if you could go back, looking over your career, and give your younger self a little bit of advice, what would it be?
Probably two pieces of advice. Number one, girlfriend, get comfortable with ambiguity. They're nice and cozy. People are going to look for answers. There's going to be the law. There's going to be all kinds of just, how do I do this? And it's not product, it's process. And that's what nurses are so good at, right? We're so good at just sticking with different iterations and saying, why didn't it work? What got in the way? Let's tweak it. Let's adjust it. Let's just keep going. The nurses are so good, I think, in psychedelic facilitation too, just because we can go, oh God, we're out of IV poles. All right, who has a tube sock, 2 pieces of tape, and like a TV monitor. All right, let's go.
Right.
We're so good at that. And it's so funny how much that has come up in facilitation and ketamine therapy for me too. Improvising, right? Mm-hmm. What do we do? So that'd be the first thing. And I think the second thing would probably be to give myself a reality check. I do not have enough time on this planet to do all I want or feel like I need to do in psychedelic harm reduction space, in the field of nursing. And I have to connect to my community and share this load. And that's, if anyone knows me, they'll know. You can just hit me up on Signal and just ask me a question, shoot me an email. I'm slower on email. I kind of suck on email. I'm better on text, but I'm here for it. And that's the safety. And that's also the thing that keeps my love machine going. That's the fuel, right? Is staying connected to all of you.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. And conversations like this inspire other people to do the things that we can't do.
Oh yeah. So, if people want to do psychedelic nursing, there's so much to do here. It's mind boggling.
Yeah. This organization was if we build it, maybe they will come, 3 years ago, make a website, make a Facebook page. Suddenly we've got 2,500 plus people that we send mailings out to that, so we know they're out there. And I think hearing something like what you're talking about is so important for people, especially who are maybe a few steps behind where you are in your career, to know that this is possible, and to see the hard work that you've done to get to this place, and the grand experiment that y'all are doing in Oregon, that I know you're doing everything you can to keep safe and sane. Yeah.
And y'all are only just at the few steps behind me. It wasn't very long ago that there was the very first ever Sauna Nurse Symposium, and I talked to Andrew in a breakout room and I said, so how do I make this thing in my town a career? What do I
Yes.
do? It
Right.
was just a few years ago.
It wasn't even that long ago, because I know Sauna is happening this week on Thursday and Friday. Open Nurses is a discount code. So a little plug there. But that was 2 years ago. So this is number 3. So it was just 2 years ago. So yeah, a lot can happen in a really short period of time. And we got comments coming in thanking you for being on here. And I want to thank you too. And look forward to seeing everything that you do up there in Oregon. And thanks for representing nursing so well in the great state of Oregon.
Can I give one more plug to nurses?
Please do.
One final plug.
Yeah.
Don't make the mistake I did. Don't be afraid to ask for discounts on training, on participation, on anything. Just get in there, and we so need you.
Never pay retail. Don't pay full price. Melanie, thank you so much for being on tonight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone who tuned in live, and those of you who are going to watch this on the re-record later. We appreciate your interest. All right, Melanie, thank you.